everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Noelle Sullivan. I'm the Director of Global Health Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event today. It's a part of an ongoing speaker series, and it's supported by the Provost Hollister Lecture Fund, so we wanted to say thank you there. We have two more events that'll happen in the spring as part of this year's lecture series, which I'm grateful to Peter Locke for organizing. It's a privilege to introduce our speaker today, Claire Wendland, who is Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Both a physician and a medical anthropologist, Dr. Wendland focuses on healing expertise and the globalization of biomedicine in Southern Africa. I first encountered Dr. Wendland's work as a graduate student in the spring of 2005, when one of my advisors read the title of her dissertation in an African studies pamphlet and told me I should read it. So I did, and then I emailed her out of the blue with a bunch of questions about how to organize my own hospital ethnography, which she responded to with really great advice. And just last year, I think, so this would be 20 years later, one of my students read an article she co-authored about the politics of admissions, medical admissions, and he was so moved that he ended up emailing her, and she did exactly the same thing. Don't everybody email her now, but just somebody whose wisdom and graciousness has really gone through multiple generations, and her work has had a tremendous impact on both African studies and certainly my generation and subsequent generations of medical anthropology. So her first book, which is based on that dissertation I read back in 2005, A Heart for the Work, was the first ethnography of a medical school in the Global South. She also has written or co-authored nearly 40 articles and multiple chapters, and her most recent book, Partial Stories, Maternal Death from Six Angles, is one of my favorite ethnographies on the market today. It's not only beautifully written, but it's also a deeply important work exploring the ambivalences and complexities of how differently situated people think about and collect evidence for and technologies around the issues of trying to prevent or grapple with maternal mortality. Professor Wendland's talk today is entitled Suffering, Humanity, and Scientific Medicine, a Global Health Ancestry Story. Let's give her our warmest welcome.
Thanks to Noelle for that generous introduction. We've been friends since 2008, not too long after that email exchange, and I have been really fortunate benefiting from many conversations with you about all sorts of interesting things. Thanks to Peter as well, who I've also known for a long time now. I've actually known quite a few people in here for a long time, which is nice. Maybe I'm a global health ancestor too, and so are you. I want to start by explaining why an anthropologist is working on a historical project about a peripatetic African physician in the early 20th century. And to do that, I think it's useful to start with a couple of minutes on my own history. I began graduate studies in anthropology more than a decade into a medical career. I'd been working as chief of obstetrics and gynecology in an Indian Health Service hospital in a small town on the edge of the Navajo reservation. You can just see it in the rear view of the Amtrak there. Our hospital served people from the surrounding area, which was very rural and very poor. We physicians found ourselves well prepared to handle individual pathology, but ill-equipped to address poverty, social marginalization, and racism, even though it was pretty obvious that commodity foods, substandard schooling, violence in multiple forms was more important to our patients' health than the medicines and surgeries that we could provide. We also struggled to understand our own practices as cultural phenomena. Culture was something that belonged to patients and that got in the way of good medical care. Doctors didn't have culture, we had science, right? Experience at Gallup Indian Medical Center, alongside recollections of several months spent in a chaotic referral hospital in Malawi years earlier when I'd been a medical student, threw this and other assumptions into doubt. Everyday workplace events grew into abstract questions that I had trouble letting go of. What were we doing and for whom when we were doing medicine? How did medicine's ways of knowing and acting build upon and alter or maybe prop up wider political, economic, and cultural processes? Over the next couple of decades, first as an anthropology grad student at UMass, and then as a faculty member at UW-Madison, I got to dig into questions like these. Most of that work involved ethnographic field research in Malawi, including participant observation as a physician in the clinics, wards, and operating theaters of its severely underfunded public hospitals. I got to witness the rise of this phenomenon that we call global health and studied the impact of the questionable assumptions that traveled silently alongside medical protocols, tools, and metrics. So a WHO epidemiological model for estimating maternal mortality, for instance, built in unproven assumptions about health facility safety, and thus supported punitive interventions such as home birth fines while overlooking widespread hospital care limitations. Even donated stethoscopes brought unequal power relations with them. That's maybe predictable. But medicine also turned out to travel in some more surprising ways. An early project analyzed clinical training at Malawi's then brand new College of Medicine. This is the project that Noel mentioned. The College of Medicine shared a curriculum with wealthier places, but it turned out not to be the depoliticization factory that Northern medical schools have been described as. Instead, medical trainees innovated and radicalized under very difficult working conditions. Neither collective action nor public advocacy was rare, and neither was stigmatized among medical professionals. This preference for seeing individual pathology and unseeing structural harms was not the medical universal I had imagined it to be on the Navajo reservation. It was during this early project that I first came across the name of Dr. Daniel Sharpe Malekebu, a fleeting reference in a little book celebrating the medical school's founding. Authors Wakisa Mualafu and Anderson Muula gave his name as the first Malawian to be trained as a physician. But, they commented, he had trained in America and was never permitted to practice medicine in colonial Nyasaland or in post-colonial Malawi. I filed that away as an interesting fact and moved on. A later project used ethnographic methods to better understand death from pregnancy or childbirth complications, also in Malawi. That project culminated in a second book, Partial Stories, Maternal Death from 6 Angles. This is the other one that Noel mentioned. Dr. Malekebu didn't show up in this project, but as I was working on it, I also began working with a Malawian nurse midwife who was pursuing a PhD at Wisconsin related to maternity care, Yamakani Nkoma. She mentioned that in her district hospital work, she'd often received transfers from a small maternity hospital near Chiradzulu, Malawi, one of 2 local mission hospitals founded by Dr. Malekebu almost a century earlier. So clearly there was something interesting about this guy. He'd founded 2 hospitals, but it was said he hadn't practiced. That didn't seem super likely. He was a unique figure. How many Nyasalanders went to the US for an education, much less a medical education, at the turn of the 20th century? But in Malawi, it seemed like hardly anybody outside the town of Chiradzulu knew his name. I dug around a little, found a good Wikipedia page on him, but very little scholarship. A 1975 chapter in an edited book, footnotes or fleeting references in other volumes of that era, a mention in a more recent chapter on medical mobility among missionaries that drew from these earlier works. So this story felt incomplete. I wanted to learn more and to better understand not only his life, but the bigger picture of Black international biomedicine in its early years. So the material I'll present to you today is a start. I'll give you a really brief sketch of the project as a whole, which is again, at its very beginning, so be kind, but which I'm thinking of and have tentatively outlined as a book. Then we'll dig a little deeper into one key aspect. I'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. I am not a historian, which will be plain to anybody in the room who is, and I would especially welcome anybody's suggestions for material I should be reading, ideas I should be rethinking, people I should contact. The book's working title is To Help My People, Medicine in the Black International in the Early 20th Century. My intent with it is to track the experience of medically trained Africans who moved internationally in a time of real intellectual and political ferment, and to better understand the roles they played in creating or contesting knowledge on Black health. Were people of African descent sturdy and disease resistant? Were they so vulnerable to disease that they were destined to die out? Or were they basically healthy but biologically suited only to tropical climates? Did their cultural practices protect individual and social health? Or were they harmful and backward? Which was the greater threat to Black communities, bodily vulnerability or racism? To quote physician C.V. Roman, was it the colored man's susceptibility to disease that was the greater problem for public health, or was it the white man's immunity to fact? The book will be loosely organized around the experiences of one of those African intellectuals, the man I already mentioned to you, Malawi's first medical doctor, Daniel Sharpe Malekebu. As a child in 1900, Malekebu had become one of the very first converts at a brand new Baptist mission in the British protectorate of Nyasaland, in the town that is now Chiradzulu, Malawi. Here's colonial Nyasaland, which went through several official names about this time. It's in the southeastern portion of the African continent. And here's Chiradzulu. Soon after his baptism, Malekebu was recruited to be houseboy for a missionary nurse, Emma Delaney, one of two Black American Baptists who helped to found the Providence Industrial Mission alongside Nyasaland's Reverend John Chilembwe. Malekebu helped her around the household and eventually with medical tasks like wound cleaning, and he learned English so quickly that he was soon able to serve as her translator. When Delaney was recalled to the US in 1905, this was totally normal. The missionaries went out and then they were recalled on furlough back to the States. Malekebu wanted to go along, but his parents said no, and Delaney did too, telling him there was no money to pay his passage. So Malekebu ran away. He walked some 350 miles to the coast of Mozambique, worked his passage on a freighter from Beira to London, seasick all the way, and then found a job on a second one, headed from London to New York. Ellis Island officials contacted a Baptist pastor who helped him get a ticket on a southbound train. After months of travel, he rejoined Delaney. He was then about 15 years old. The Black American National Baptist Convention, impressed, agreed that if he also worked, they would sponsor his education, high school, college, medical school. Here he is at graduation from Meharry and in that year's yearbook. Chapter 1, Circulating Kinfolk, places Malekebu's journey in the context of an era when a surprising number of Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, and African Americans circulated around the Atlantic through the US, the Caribbean, Western and Southern Africa, and the British Isles in search of higher education. Many of them sought out medical and nursing training. Many of them also formed families with Black professionals from other backgrounds. Malekebu's story is distinctive, but it actually wasn't unique. This was a time when missionaries thought it quite reasonable to bring African children to the Jim Crow South for education, including education in hygiene, nursing, and medicine. Two other boys from Chiradzulu, Nyasaland, were simultaneously in America, brought to Kentucky by the other American missionary at Providence Industrial Mission, Reverend Landon Cheek, along with his own two surviving children and his wife, Rachel, who was John Chilembwe's niece from Chiradzulu. The couple had buried a third child in Nyasaland. Meanwhile, at Spelman Seminary, a school for Black women in Atlanta, an assortment of young women had been brought from the Congo over several years by other missionaries. Some of the Congo girls, as they were known, were the mixed-race children of white merchants whom missionaries in the Congo were paid to take in. Missionaries also redeemed or ransomed girls and young women who'd been enslaved, training them up as future wives for redeemed boys who would therefore not be tempted to marry heathens. As you can imagine, there was some internal tension in the missions over this practice. Some missionaries questioned just how different it was from buying slaves. The Congo girls taken to Spelman included Saluka Youngblood, who would earn an MD at Meharry and open a successful medical practice in Georgia with her American husband, and her sister Emma, who became a highly respected nurse. Emma is second from the left in this picture from the Spelman archives. Lena Clark, who would return to Congo as a talented missionary linguist, who is at the far left in this picture. Clark was the interviewer and translator for diplomat Roger Casement during his time in the Congo Free State and was pivotal in documenting the sexual violence that was a part of Belgian King Leopold's Red Rubber regime of terror. And Flora Zetto, not in this picture, who was brought to Atlanta as an infant and was known as the Spelman baby. When Emma Delaney was at Providence Industrial Mission, she showed photographs of the Spelman baby to her houseboy, Daniel Malekebu. Zetto grew up to graduate from Spelman and become a talented classical pianist. She would eventually marry Malekebu, go back with him to Africa, and help to run the hospitals and school they founded together. So these are just a few examples. I'm tracking down more, but I think these few do give you a sense of how these multilingual and multicultural folks quietly connected contexts that many powerful interests would have preferred to remain separate. Medicine was one way in which those connections were made. Chapter 2 will describe early 20th century medical landscapes. Policymakers were seeking insight on what was called in the US the Negro problem from both doctors and anthropologists, even as the two fields were consolidating and professionalizing. Medicine was transforming in this period. It had been a craft, it was becoming scientific medicine. And the prestige attached to being a doctor was increasing significantly. Maybe it's not surprising that gatekeeping also ratcheted up at this time, both in Europe and North America, and that access for Black students and for women got much more constrained. Britain reversed earlier policy and stopped admitting Africans for training. In the US, the Flexner Report put medicine on a sounder scientific footing, but also disproportionately shut down schools that admitted women and Blacks. Meharry and Howard were the only post-Flexner Black medical schools to survive. Both of them became critical to research and teaching on Black health and for training of Black physicians from the US, the Caribbean, and Africa. Malekebu wasn't even the only African in his 1917 Meharry graduating class. Post-grad training was just as segregated and even scarcer, given that early 20th century hospitals, both in Britain's colonies and in the US, were overwhelmingly for whites. If Blacks were admitted at all, it was to separate and often distinctly unhealthy and undersupplied wards. Malekebu had to move north for residency training to Mudgett's Hospital and Nurse Training School for Black Philadelphians. I've found almost nothing so far about Malekebu's time at Mudgett's. It should have overlapped both with the July 1918 race riot in Philadelphia and with the first wave of the influenza pandemic, which hit Philadelphia really hard. However, I do know that in the 2 years he was at Mudgett's, he simultaneously worked at the University of Pennsylvania's anthropology department. Hired by department chair Frank Speck, he lectured on Africans and their customs, taught the linguists Chiao, attended meetings of the Anthropology Society of Pennsylvania, and met future anthropology leaders, including Franz Boas and Irving Hallowell, both later to be presidents of the American Anthropological Association and very well known. In fact, Folktales Malekebu dictated and translated became Hallowell's first peer-reviewed publication. They appear in the Journal of Folklore, alongside Folktales Told to Franz Boas by Kamba Sumanga, a Mozambican of Vandao ethnicity who was then a student at Columbia Teachers College. African folklore and customs could be a divisive topic. Unlike many of their white American counterparts, Black American missionaries often referred to Africans in kinship terms as brothers and sisters, and were both alert to and often vocal about the colonial brutalities they faced. Like white American missionaries, however, Black Americans tended to describe Africans as downtrodden primitives whose heathen customs should be stamped out. I've read many letters now by Emma Delaney, Malekebu's much-loved sponsor and teacher, and so far have not encountered anything but scorn and revulsion for any African custom. But the African intellectuals who worked in anthropology or described their communities of origin to anthropologists and linguists in this era took a different tack. Malekebu defended the wholesome customs of Africa with pride. Chapter 3 explores contributions of Africans to debates over custom and health, and I'll come back to this too in just a couple minutes. By 1921, Malekebu was married. His residency at Mudgett's was over. He had spent several months studying theology at Moody Bible Institute in this city, and he and Zeto were ready to return to Africa. But return was not to be easy. The situation in Chiradzulu had changed. Malekebu's home church was gone, demolished and then burned, in fact. The pastor who had founded the mission and baptized Malekebu, John Chilembwe, had led one of Africa's earliest anti-colonial revolts in 1915, preaching his final sermon at the Providence Industrial Mission alongside the severed head of a white plantation manager stuck onto a pole in the nave. The rebels were outgunned, the rebellion was crushed, its followers jailed, its leaders executed. The colonial government made a series of postcards celebrating the demolition of the church. You see 2 of the series of 8 here. Ultimately, inquiries in Britain's parliament laid much of the blame for the revolt not on the racist provocations of whites in Nyasaland, nor on the expropriation of African land and the exploitation of African labor by colonial officials, all of which Chilembwe had explicitly denounced, but on the radical influence of so-called American Negroes. Malekebu and Zeto's first attempt to return and reopen the mission was 6 years after the uprising, and colonial officials were not having it. Fearing another Chilembwe, they searched the couple's possessions and found a pamphlet Malekebu had written entitled A Plea for Africa. In it, he argued that Africans deserved medical care and higher education, and particularly called out the need for both among women. These radical ideas got the couple deported. Turned away from Nyasaland, they spent 5 years in a rural Liberian mission instead. The quiet of those years, the increasing pressure from Africans for medical care and education, and the intervention of missionary and educator go-betweens who promised that the couple would remain apolitical, ultimately reassured Nyasaland officials. Allowed re-entry in 1926 despite some continued opposition, Malekebu and Zeto rebuilt Providence Industrial Mission's church and school, immediately adding a boarding school. They opened a first hospital in 1927 and built a second in the early 1940s. Records of their deportation, return, and subsequent surveillance show them walking a tightrope for years, working for better health, education, and political voice for the community while attempting, but not always successfully, to deflect colonial suspicion. For instance, Malekebu founded and was the driving force behind the Chiradzulu District Native Association, which brought petitions to the district commissioner about matters such as forced labor and land appropriation. But the colonial archives show that those meetings were infiltrated by spies who reported on his activities to the chief commissioner of police. A handwritten note on the commissioner's letter refers to Malekebu this way: his movements and actions should be watched carefully, and if he gives cause for action against him to be taken, he can be dealt with. That is, deported again. It appears to be true that colonial officials never granted Malekebu a physician's license to practice in Nyasaland, even though the country's medical council agreed at an executive meeting that his credentials were appropriate for licensure. The licensure records that I found with the help of our wonderful African Studies librarian, by the way, Kimberly Rooney, suggest that race was a critical factor in colonial medical stratification. It appears that whites with medical training could get licensed as physicians. Indians could only get licenses as sub-assistant surgeons until the late 1920s, when some began to be admitted to the physician's register. And Africans could never be more than hospital assistants, no matter what their actual educational credentials. That didn't mean, though, that they weren't practicing medicine. In reality, many small hospitals were run by hospital assistants, operating in both the managerial and the surgical senses of that word, without supervision by licensed physicians. And Malekebu did operate this way. His own accounts and interviews, as well as contemporaneous accounts by others, show him treating wounds, administering medications, and training lay workers, including his wife, Flora Zeto, and his assistant, Pastor Leonard Mocha, to do the same while he was away on his frequent evangelizing and fundraising trips. By 1940, Malekebu had trained 5 women to handle basic midwifery cases. The mission by then boasted of a modest 16-bed brick hospital with 4 4-bed wards, a drug room, and an examination and treatment room, in which Malekebu proudly recounted that thousands of patients had been seen. Work on a second, larger hospital was underway. From the time they reopened Providence Industrial Mission, Malekebu and Zeto spent roughly half their remaining years in Nyasaland, witnessing the independence transition to Malawi, and roughly half in the US. Malekebu, in fact, held an American passport. On this side of the Atlantic, American Black newspapers report on their many lectures on African life and mission work at churches and philanthropic societies. A church in Cleveland for several decades hosted an annual Malekebu Day to raise money for the hospitals of Providence Industrial Mission, for instance. And Malekebu and Zeto were featured guests for several of these events. Their lecture tours spanned some 40 years and traversed several technologies. Malekebu's tours began in the last years of the Magic Lantern era, a time when traveling showmen combined instruction and entertainment to various ends, including popularizing science, educating on hygiene and disease, and generating religious fervor. In later decades, slides and motion pictures took the place of the Magic Lantern and its images of African life on glass slides. So Chapter 5, Suffering Humanity and Scientific Medicine, will describe these lectures if I am able to find materials on them. So far, that's been elusive. I can give you a little bit of the flavor of these events, though, through the program of a half-day-long hospital fundraiser held at a Philadelphia ethnographic museum in the 1950s. It began with a speech by Malekebu's Meharry roommate, pediatrician Whittier H. Wright, who had established a children's hospital in North Philadelphia. A substantial musical part of the program included chamber music, played by Morris's String Ensemble, Accra-born textile artist and musician Francis Saka Akwaya, known for introducing Ghanaian high-life music to the U.S., and Pennsylvania singer Esther Halpern, who performed Yiddish folk songs. Last up came Malekebu, giving a lecture and showing motion pictures about medical conditions and hospital care in Nyasaland. So while I don't know whether any lecture notes, recordings, lantern slides, or films have survived, I have found a few journalistic accounts in which reporters used stories of medical care in Africa that he told and turned them to various purposes. So in one case, for instance, a reporter cited an interview with Malekebu to depict long-suffering African women as virtuous role models for over-picky American wives. Malekebu had described suturing up a terrible head wound that a woman had received from her husband. According to Malekebu, we said at the time that due to the severity of the attack that the woman could certainly claim a divorce from her husband, but she refused this and went back to him. The reporter, who blames Satan and Satan's influence on women for the dissolution of the American family, provided Malekebu's story, quote, in contrast of the American wife who sues for mental cruelty on the grounds that her husband eats crackers in bed, end quote. You never know how your stories are going to land, do you? A concluding chapter 6 will outline how American-trained Africans complicate the familiar histories of 20th century medicine and anthropology as each discipline made claims for expertise about the lives of Africans and people of African descent. So, what contribution did Malekebu and other African clinicians who moved internationally make to knowledge about Africans and about Black health and well-being? I'll tell you the truth right now, I'm not really sure. But I'm going to take the little I've found and consider its two interlocking parts, knowledge on bodily well-being and knowledge on social well-being. Baseline conditions for Black health in many parts of the southern United States were atrocious in the early decades of the 20th century, as W.E.B. Du Bois and others documented, and so were baseline conditions in many parts of the colonies. Infectious disease burdens were heavy, malnutrition widespread. In the American South, Black life expectancy was lower than white, Black infant mortality higher. Black rates of tuberculosis, hypertension, and maternal mortality were much higher than those among whites. In the colonies, by the way, I've found no measures of this kind, although physicians did sometimes refer to health conditions as appalling. Mainstream medicine, dominated by white European and American clinicians, tended often to depict these differences as reflecting biological and sometimes also moral inferiority. This was, you will recall, the era of eugenics. This, on the left, is the logo of the Second International Eugenics Conference. The first International Eugenics Congress had been held at the University of London the year before Malekebu began his medical training. Charles Darwin's son presided. Luminaries from the Americas and Europe, including Winston Churchill, attended. In an augury of what was to come, a Berlin physician spoke on implications of racial hygiene for obstetrics. It was a time when the most revered clinician and medical educator in North America, William Osler, could console an intern who was lamenting the many pneumonia deaths on the colored ward that these deaths should be no surprise. After all, quote, the colored, usually both syphilitic and alcoholics, were the worst risk in pulmonary disease, end quote. Even the white leadership at Meharry, a Black medical school, could share these commonplace assumptions about biological, social, and moral inferiority, and sometimes used them explicitly to justify the lack of Black representation in the school's leadership, as late as 1940. Yet cutting-edge research by Black physicians at the same institution showed health differences to be the products of social and economic disadvantage, not biological difference. Long before Malekebu was a student there, Meharry physician-scientist Robert Boyd had already made the earliest known detailed observations about health conditions among city-dwelling Black Americans. He not only published this work for medical colleagues in a paper with the title, What are the Causes of the Great Mortality Among the Negroes in the Cities of the South, and How is that Mortality to be Lessened?, but also lectured in the pulpits of Nashville, in the Black churches there, on the implications for protecting communities against tuberculosis specifically. Not long after Malekebu's time, another Meharry physician-scientist, Dr. Michael Bent, did a detailed study of the rural population of Tennessee. His team found that socioeconomic inequities were responsible for the high rates of disease and premature death in Black communities. Where Black men and women had the opportunity to live under good economic and sanitary conditions, the incidence of disease dropped dramatically, approaching the level seen among whites. One of Malekebu's most prominent faculty members at Meharry was the Canadian-American Charles Victor Roman, usually known as C.V. Roman. Roman was tireless in advocating for Black Americans in terms of both health and justice, which he saw as intertwined. Some prominent white physicians in this era argued that the South's so-called Negro problem would be solved soon because Black Americans were so sickly they would just die out. Others raised alarm about the impact of Black communities on white public health. Claimed the editor of the Southern Medical Journal in 1919, "They are, to say the least, a menace to the health of the people who have made many sacrifices for their comfort and upbuilding," end quote. Again and again, Roman argued against these characterizations and warnings. Poverty, vice, ignorance, and disease were problems that vex society everywhere, he pointed out. Sorry, that was a quote. And here's another. "The effort to make them appear as peculiar phases of the race question in the South is both inaccurate and unjust. Inaccurate because it gives questions that are purely economic and ethnic coloring and makes universal problems appear as Negro problems. Unjust because it alienates from a struggling people the sympathy that a just cause should command and intensifies racial antipathies by making frailties that are human and universal appear as hideous Negro vices," end quote. A full century before Dorothy Roberts described race as a political category masquerading as a biological one and argued against race-based disease, Roman was making much the same argument. Now, Malekebu does not appear to have been responding directly to powerful medical and political leaders, as Roman clearly was. I've found no medical journal articles or op-eds by him. The limited written archives he left suggest that when he wrote, as when he spoke, he was mostly addressing his fellow Baptists, Black and white, and others who might fund Baptist medical missions. But with those audiences, he too fought against dehumanization for people of African descent. Sometimes he did so by turning the tables on his audiences, making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, as anthropologists like to say. In his lecture tours, he would explain how the elders in Chiradzulu had warned him not to go to America because of the cannibals there. A reporter described his presentation in Ardmore, Pennsylvania in 1917. Quote, "To the amusement and instruction of the audience, the doctor related many of the tribal peculiarities of the natives. He was told not to come to this country because the people would eat him up." The reporter went on to speculate on what American mob violence would look like if those rumors were true. If cannibalism were legalized to the extent of making the mob eat up its victim, what would happen? Like Roman, Malekebu too drew on his medical training to make the case for our common humanity. In the plea for Africa that he had printed up in 1918, you might recall this is the document that got him deported from Nyasaland in 1921, he used medical language to make the case that Africans are fully human. He began with a little vignette from traveling in Florida with Emma Delaney when he'd newly arrived in the US, travels he must have made at about the same time as the young Congolese man, Oda Benga, was being exhibited in the monkey house at the Bronx Zoo. Malekebu and Delaney were visiting the home of one of Delaney's friends when another friend called by phone, eager to come over and see the African boy. Malekebu reports that the caller asked, "Is the boy really an African? Has he any eyes? Can he talk? Has he any feet, hands, nose, ears, mouth? Well, how does he look? Does he look like us in any way?" Malekebu follows this story by noting that, quote, "I have found in many cases, even with the educated class of people, it is not thoroughly understood what is meant by heathen African. Some have in mind a heathen African as a sort of wild animal or a monkey that lives in the woods, caves, or treetops. But what is a heathen African?" Here, the pamphlet features a photograph of two smiling young women sitting on a reed mat, wrapped in cloth below the waist and nothing above. Quote, "The answer in short, you see the picture of these two splendid specimens of human beings with all the attributes that go to make up a human race. See closely their physical makeup. They're not dressed, never mind about that. Their morals are as high as the tone of the key of G. Look at their nose, it is not flat as it is usually attributed to us. Their lips are not so thick that they cannot be trained and used to the glory of God. Their feet are not so large that they cannot walk to school in the house of God. Their fingers are not so stiff and ankylosed that they cannot be made flexible and trained to be used at a piano or domestic arts. Their brains and gray matter are not frozen and hardened, that they cannot be loosened up and become able to assimilate and retain the Western civilization. And I imagine their pulse rate beats 72 times a minute like any other human race. To make a long story short, a heathen African is simply a diamond in the rough. See closely their physical makeup, Malekebu is instructing his his readers. Their hands flex like yours do. Their heart beats like yours. They possess a lively gray matter, both intelligence and moral sense. And on this basis, like any other human race, they deserve medical care, Bible teaching, and higher education. This call to common humanity wasn't unique to Malekebu. It was widely shared among physicians of African descent. Work that appeared in medical journals or was published in conference abstracts is the least difficult to trace, which is why I've been able to read quite a bit of C.V. Roman's work and also later that of W. Montague Cobb, physician and first Black American PhD in anthropology. Both of these men combined civil rights activism with scholarly work to disprove scientific justifications for racism. Much harder to trace are the popular lectures of the era, and that is where Malekebu was most active. He spoke in churches across the South, the Midwest, and the Mid-Atlantic. In the year of his graduation, the yearbook editor, who was also his roommate and remained a lifelong friend, could already say of Malekebu that he has traveled very extensively, thus is known among some of the leading people of this country. In every subsequent journey to the US from 1918 to the late 60s, he gave lecture tours, sometimes accompanied by Zeto, sometimes not, to raise funds for Providence Industrial Mission. Many newspaper reports about them refer to the important medical work being done at the mission's 2 hospitals. But differences in bodily health and survival and the implications for medicine weren't the only topic for lectures, pamphlets, and debates. What about social well-being? How to educate Africans? Stamp out their customs? Steer them in a healthy direction? Provide broad-based liberal arts teaching? Or prepare Africans or Black Americans for agricultural lives? Was industrial education, as it was called in the early 20th century, the key to Black liberation, or yet another way to foster exploitation? These topics were contested internationally, and the people working on them were speaking to each other across the nations, too. In colonial Nyasaland, until at least 1927, all formal education for Africans was mission-run. Denominations were divided on the question of industrial versus liberal arts education. In the US, key figures in the dispute were W.E.B. Du Bois, who favored the education of a Black elite, and Booker T. Washington, who prioritized teacher training and the practical skills necessary for Black self-reliance. Malekebu greatly admired Washington's Tuskegee Institute, which he visited on one of his lecture tours in Alabama. In many respects, he modeled PIM's curriculum after Tuskegee's, including its focus on teacher training and on moral and religious principles, although he insisted on access to classical as well as vocational education to an extent that worried government inspectors in the late 1920s. I see his take as fairly mainstream among Black educators of his day. He tried to leave as many options for his students open as a repressive situation would allow. On the question of African customs, though, Malekebu's perspectives on social well-being and the role of customary practices were quite different from those of many contemporaries and from all of the other mission schools that I've found records for. Emma Delaney had nothing good to say about the customs of the African community where she lived for 5 years. I've read a lot of her letters. Repeatedly, she describes the people as ignorant, cruel, diseased, heartless, and dirty. That characterization was commonplace among missionaries, even Black American missionaries. But Malekebu's perspective was different, even when in some cases he was describing the very same customs as Delaney was. In The Plea for Africa, for instance, he praised ordinary village life for its communal ethos, citing a common proverb, "What is mine dies, what is ours abides." Here's a long quote from him. "All work for each other and each works for all. If a man is building a house, all he has to do is call for his friends. When harvest time comes, we all help each other. If a neighbor is sick, he need not worry, for there will be plenty of friends to give him water and food. If a person is traveling a long distance, he need not be bothered about where will I get my next meal or where am I going to sleep. For all over Africa, we practice the golden rule rather than preach it." This theme of communal effort appeared in the folk tales he recounted and translated for Hallowell, too. The longer of these 2 stories recounts how a group of zebras figured out that they could work together to kick to death a lion who was terrorizing them, which we can read as a pretty pointed political parable. His printed work wasn't the only place that Malekebu defended African practices. Once they'd established their school, Malekebu and Zeto were notable for continuing certain local traditions they considered to be good for young people, such as initiation ceremonies in modified Christianized forms. Malekebu explained to a Cleveland reporter in 1950 that PIM had separate boys and girls organization to teach the children at the proper age the wholesome customs of Africa, which must not be forgotten. Now, I don't want to overstate this case. He didn't see all customs as wholesome. In interviews later in life, he also recalled difficulties with witchcraft, and he particularly juxtaposed it to medicine. In 1940, he described the pressure he felt to demonstrate the power of the doctor's scientific medicine, as he called it, in cases of bewitchment. Someone has told them the sick person has been bewitched and cannot live. Since he is going to die, let us take him to the mission hospital. It is at this time, with this sick person, the miracle must be performed. In a newspaper interview in 1961, he attributed great improvement in medical conditions to the abandonment of witchcraft and to people coming to trust and rely on medical science. By the way, this picture is not quite from the right part of the country, and the photograph is pretty obviously staged, but I couldn't resist including the image. It's by the great early Malawian photographer, M.M. Chususe. So summing up so far, Malekebu and other African-born clinicians seem to have participated in political struggles about Black life in the early 20th century in ways that are easily to overlook, using the language of bodily and spiritual health and speaking in popular venues. In their professional circles, members of the African diaspora mingled, married, and shared ideas, from Monrovia to Chiradzulu to Philadelphia. There's reason to believe that the contribution of these circles to popular knowledge about Black well-being has been under-recognized and under-analyzed on both sides of the Atlantic. Today, outside Chiradzulu, students learn English in Spelman Hall. Patients seek treatment at a hospital named for U.S. civil rights activist S. Willie Layton. In Malawi, the Reverend John Chilembwe is a national hero. His image graces the country's banknotes. An annual holiday celebrates his rebellion. Any school child can tell you his story. But Dr. Malekebu is only a footnote in the Malawian political or American ecclesiastical histories. His name does still appear on a couple of the historical markers at Providence Industrial Mission, but the Malawian archivists I worked with last summer hadn't heard of him, nor were they aware of Black Americans' role in Nyasaland's early years. That lead archivist, who is a very sharp guy, thought American Black missionaries first came to his country in the 1970s. Now, part of the reason that Malekebu has disappeared so thoroughly is a quirk of Malawian political history. Malawi's second physician also walked to the coast, made his way to America, and got a degree at Meharry exactly 20 years after Malekebu. This second physician also collaborated with anthropologists and linguists while he was in the US, lectured on conditions in Africa to philanthropic audiences, married a woman he met here, and was sobered by his encounters with American racism. His name was Hastings Kamuzu Banda. He became the first post-independence ruler of Malawi and in short order proclaimed himself president for life, which he nearly was, ruling from 1964 to 1994. Banda liked to be thought of as Malawi's first doctor. Evidence suggests that he actively suppressed Malekebu's story and downplayed his impact. But I don't think deliberate suppression is all of the reason that the archivists and I didn't really know about Malekebu. I think he fits uncomfortably in the histories that many of us think we already know. In Malawi, about the struggle for independence. In the US, about Black activism during the Reconstruction era in the Jim Crow South. Internationally, about the fight against scientific racism in both medicine and anthropology, and about the earliest days of global health. This man's life, and the lives of others like Lena Clark, Saluka Youngblood, Kamba Simanga, and many more thread together parts of the early 20th century, both geographical and topical, that I have long thought of separately. And the existence of these threads means that they were never so separate as all that. And so I think it's useful to think about Dr. Daniel Malekebu as one of our global health ancestors, someone who helps us to re-envision the very long history of what we now call global health and its entanglements with religion, nationalism, and racism. There are things to learn from this story for anyone engaged in global health work today. I hope you've heard some tentative answers to the questions I posed many years ago. What are we doing and for whom when we're doing medicine? How do medicine's ways of knowing prop up or alter or build upon wider political, economic, and cultural processes. I'm going to close with just a couple of preliminary thoughts, just quick. What's at stake in depictions of African bodies and cultures is very much dependent on who's doing the depicting. Funding and the pressures of fundraising shape messages. Both Delaney and Malekebu stressed medical need quite explicitly to raise funds for their clinical work. Delaney boasted of her success in treating wounds, Malekebu of the miracles that helped to vanquish witchcraft. Delaney emphasized the plight of young girls who might be married to unsuitable heathens against their will. Malekebu seems to have emphasized and admired the stoicism of African women. I suspect that scholars of global health history and of anthropological history have underestimated the role of church lectures in generating and spreading ideas about Africans and African health and life. From the vantage point of early to mid-20th century newspapers and newsletters, it looks like the medical and ethnographic content of these lectures was really very substantial. And finally, assiduously steering clear of politics does not mean politics won't bite you in a sensitive place eventually. Several early East African physicians played prominent roles in politics, as did Hastings Banda. Malekebu took a different and quieter tack. As I see them, his efforts, such as establishing the Chiradzulu District Native Association and taking a principled stand against the forced labor system called Tangata, were real but indirect, and they were constrained. He was able to re-enter Nyasaland only after he promised to colonial officials that he wouldn't be a politically disruptive influence. And this problem had real costs for him and his family. I can talk more about that in Q&A if you want. It also cost him a place in history as nationalism came to be seen as a more vital contribution than medicine was. Malekebu, Zeto, Delaney, and others who bridged colonized Africa and the Jim Crow South were among those who built knowledge about Black well-being across disciplines and among diverse publics, including many a church group. There's more research to come, but eventually I hope to describe the paths they walked, the uses to which they put their knowledge, and the ways their experiences reverberated among communities intensely interested in Black health, and reverberate still today. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. I will come up to you with this microphone.
Suggestions too, very welcome. Or arguments.
Thanks so much, Claire. That was just incredible. And I honestly don't, I think the detective work of research is the historical work. So it's not, I mean, I would never feel like you're not doing proper history because this is historical reconstruction, and I think you're doing an excellent job. I'm just struck, these fault lines, I've done a little bit of work on the Baptist missionary expeditions to the Congo and seen some of the things. I mean, I think you're spot on in terms of the heathen, pagan kind of axis. And for the doctors that were training in England and France and Germany in the 1880s, 1890s, there were similar kinds of fault lines, and the kind of transatlantic networks were very real then. I mean, Ida B. Wells was in London in the 1890s, met with some Nigerian doctors and Ghanaian lawyers in training, and they went back quite aware of the different movements. What I'm struck by are these different fault lines. I mean, this issue of customs, I think you could delve a little bit more deeply into. The medical licensing, unfortunately, I know a lot about. I say unfortunately because it's really tedious.
Why is it?
But by the, I mean, just to share some of my own research with you, and I won't take too long. You know, the African continent by the 1950s had the greatest number of exemption clauses in its medical licensing laws, which allowed African therapeutic practices to persist under other umbrellas. And so, you know, that very issue of what was happening on the ground and who was doing what, I think was always quite messy. And I think people learned quite quickly how to navigate the surveillance of colonial states. So that sounds quite right. Oguntola Sapara was one of the physicians in Nigeria in the 1890s. who went back, and he became a kind of informant on various professional societies that were not converting through the missionaries, that were rejecting Christianity, that were insisting on therapeutic practices. So one small piece that I felt like could be developed a bit more are ideas of medical landscapes and healthy land. It's not just about collective practice. I mean, that was the one kind of thread, and I think I've written a piece on Pan-African organizing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s around the WHO and UNESCO and the vision, the therapeutic vision. It was a lot about reintegrating concepts of health that biomedical practices kept pushing to the margins. And it did have a lot to do with older, including in the history of the environmental sciences in Europe, ideas of vital landscapes. And, if you saw the postcard you showed of the alleged witch doctor barefoot, embedded in the land, like feet on the ground. Mm-hmm. And I just was struck by there's kind of a subtext to his life story that you could risk writing out, that he probably wrote out.
Yeah.
And you might want to bring it in.
Yeah, I haven't addressed the land stuff at all. Every time he got a big enough donation, he bought up more land for the mission, some of which was farmed and some of which was left. And sometimes he did that in I'm going to establish a leper colony. That never actually happened, but he did have all this farmland for the mission. So I suspect there is a land piece. Thank you for insisting that I pay attention to that.
Hi, fantastic presentation. I loved it. My name is Daniel. I'm a physician over at Evanston Hospital, and I'm adjunct faculty here at Northwestern. I just want to give you more of a broad question, a little of a softball for you. We of course live in a incredibly rapidly changing world, not just technologically, but also innovation and the rate of information that we are able to accumulate now. Through this work that you've done, what general lessons do you think can be applied from that which you've seen to the 21st century as we try to bridge these types of medical cultural distinctions between groups, such that we can try in the 21st century to try to learn from mistakes and learn from the things that your work has shown? Yeah,
I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if there's any sci-fi nerds in the room, but do you remember the remake of Battlestar Galactica, where the thing is all of this has happened before, all of this will happen again? That goes through my mind an awful lot. And not just with this history. So I think one of the things that's important about this is it is true that the world has changed a lot. It is true that communications technologies and the ease of travel and the ways that money can flow have substantially changed the world. But I think that we can sometimes see our world as so radically new that we don't see these earlier traces, right? So in fact, the world has been interconnected for a long, long, long time. For a lot of people. People have been learning from each other, and ideas that grow up in one part of the world are often fertilized to grow into new shapes in other parts of the world. I think that we can learn from that to pay attention to the particular patterns, the social patterns, who's connecting with whom to make decisions, who's never at the table at all, who's trying to make an argument, and where can that argument get heard. I mean, this guy, C.V. Roman, he was brilliant. His writings are amazing, but he could only get them published in the Journal of the National Medical Association, which was a black journal, which he had founded. He was pretty much stonewalled out from maybe is either not the right word or a way too right word, I'm not sure. He was kept out of the more mainstream medical publications, right, of the day. So thinking about sort of some things like, where do people get published? What platforms are given to whom to speak? Who do we recognize as our ancestors in global health? I think that this can have practical practical impact. Just, I guess, on our durability, maybe, on our persistence in the face of reversals. Like, these folks worked for decades and decades to get something done, and they did. And it was quiet, and they're forgotten. But they made a real difference, I think. So, I don't know, that's a sort of inchoate answer to a good question. I'll think about it more, but I would say, just to paraphrase, there's a theologian who said, Walter Brueggemann, who said, memory breeds hope and amnesia breeds despair. So I'd like to be on the side of memory here, because I do think that there's a lot of place to find hope in a tough time.
More questions or comments?
Or suggestions. What should I read? I'm serious.
Thank you for that presentation. I learned a great deal. You mentioned at some point in your presentation that the families had like negative implications of this work or something like that, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a sad piece. There are actually a few sad pieces of this story, but this is a sad piece of the story. So Emma Delaney, you remember who she was, right? She's his mentor. So once Daniel Malekebu, I think to her surprise, finds his way back to the United States to rejoin her, she's like, well, I should raise money to get his sister Ruth here too. Because his little sister Ruth had also become a member of Delaney's household and was also left behind when Delaney was recalled back to the US. So Emma Delaney goes out and, tries to raise some money with Spelman alumni, saying like, look, there's this wonderful young woman, and she's likely to be married off to an unsuitable heathen unless we can bring her here. This fundraising effort does not succeed, and Ruth never is brought to the United States. However, she does marry. Does Delaney think this is an unsuitable heathen? I don't know. I don't know what Delaney thinks of it, but the person she marries is a young import-export clerk who works in Beira in Mozambique, who was jailed for 3 years for his part in the Chilembwe rebellion, but ultimately released, and then was jailed again after he and Ruth were married for bringing in Marcus Garveyite literature and Union literature from South Africa into Malawi, both of which were forbidden. So he was put back in jail with hard labor for 3 years. At this point, Malekebu's back in the country. And this guy, Ruth's husband, Issa Lawrence, his friends are trying to get him out of jail. And there's this tense exchange of letters in which they write to Ruth and they say, we know we're not supposed to bother the doctor because it's a threat to the mission, right? So they're not going to get him involved at all. And you can just read the tension in those letters. Like, this is somebody who's fairly highly placed who could help us, but we can't, right? So ultimately, Lawrence does get out of jail. I think that Malekebu did help them quietly. I think on Issa Lawrence went by a few different names, and on one of the government inspections of the Providence Industrial Mission schools in the early 1930s, there's a list of teachers that are on the payroll. Ruth Lawrence is one of them, and another name I think is actually Issa Lawrence, who wasn't supposed to be working there, but I think was. So I think that there may have been some quiet ways that happened, but it all had to be kept really quiet. Issa Lawrence ultimately went on to be one of the founding members and the first treasurer of the Nyasaland African Congress, which was the group that brought Malawi to independence. So many interesting rabbit holes, right?
Thank you, Claire. That was a really interesting talk. I'm trying to formulate, there's a lot of stuff going on in my head, but I'll just try to formulate a really simple question. If you had to think about how anti-colonialism and anti-racism are working in relation to religious proselytization in the mind of, how would you sort of work that out?
Yeah, That is a really tough question and one that I have thought about. So Malekebu, once he's back in Malawi, does not do a lot of explicitly anti-colonial anything. And he has not left much of a writing trail. He does have a couple of documents which have not been digitized in Edinburgh, which I'm hoping to go see this coming year. So I'm hoping there might be something there. So I don't have a lot in writing, but in this earlier document, A Plea for Africa, he does have some basically Africa for the Africans ideas in there. They're not explicitly revolutionary. I mean, I think you could read them that way, but it would be a stretch to read them now. I think that religion was really foundational for a bunch of these folks to be thinking about like one common human race, all the children of God, right? We are all the children of God. I know that religion worked differently in among the enslavers in this period and among a lot of other people too, right? It was. Yeah, and thinking about this as like, think about how religion was, it was caught up in liberation, it was caught up in literacy, right? And it was caught up in political power. So in that sense, it was caught up with Christianity and liberation were caught up too, because all of these, really almost all of these folks, not just the physicians, but the anti-colonial activists, were people who had been educated and made literate almost totally in Christian schools. So, and that's also true in the Black South in this era. So it's super interesting. It's complicated. It's difficult for an agnostic to find her way through. I'm trying my best, but yeah, any suggestions for who or what to read on this would be great. I haven't been to the Baptist Missionary Archives yet. The ones at Mercer? That's great.
Oh, yeah. I know somebody who said that. Oh, I know somebody who said that.
Oh, that's cool.
The Baptist Missionary Archives. I went to the one in Emory.
Oh, I didn't know there was an Emory. Okay.
The American Baptist Missionary Archive.
Okay.
There's also a big one at Oxford in the UK, the British Baptist Missionary Archives.
Okay.
They have a lot of material.
That'd be great. Thank you for those suggestions.
Hi, Professor Wenlin. My name's Erica, and I'm an undergrad. I remember you talking about witchcraft, and I wanted to ask how Dr. Malekebu navigated Western models of medicine while also existing within African frameworks of health.
The short answer to that is I don't really know. So I would like to find out. I mean, he has all these positive things to say about all sorts of African customs, but I didn't quote to you because I actually couldn't find where I put the notes on it. But there's an early interview in which he says, like, people aren't coming to my hospital because they just actually, I don't have all the stuff. I hardly have bandages and antiseptic solutions here. And they go and, they get mankwala in the bush, right? So in that sense, he clearly was identifying in opposition to some of these other kinds of healing traditions and not as positive about it. But I also have a newspaper interview in which he's talking about, like, there are a lot of very powerful herbal medications that we medicine people ought to be studying because they're really powerful. They do all these things, so we should be learning about it. So that's on an occasion when he's having a reunion with some of his Mahari classmates. So, I mean, it's not uncommon for physicians of this era to be saying, like, hey, some of the herbs are powerful. They fit pretty well into a medical epistemology, right? But all that other superstitious stuff, we ought to just stamp out. It's just an obstacle. But I don't know to what extent he shared that.
The Wellcome Trust Library has some of the 1890s correspondence about testing drugs from Malawi that I think Harry Johnston sent in. Harry Johnston
Yeah.
says that he's observed the practitioners and he's seen what they're using. And the Oxford archives have some of the doctors who were trained later, like the 19-teens, 20s, the
Yeah.
20s, 30s. And I remember in their, End of Empire series, there's a doctor from Nigeria, I'm forgetting his name, but he was quite critical of the younger generation of doctors who were so explicitly anti-colonial. I mean, the idea that the colonial state was going to end was not self-evident at any point, even into the early 1950s, to large numbers of people. So the idea that there was an anti-colonial future, I would argue, was never self-evident.
Thank you for providing me with an excuse to go to the Wellcome Library.
It may be digitized.
Ah,
Sorry.
you blew it. No, I appreciate the suggestion. And Oxford as well. Yeah, I mean, Malekebu's in this interesting little lacuna because there is a wave of physicians that are trained in the 1880s and 1890s, and then at some point Britain's like, no, we are not doing this. And I haven't nailed down the exact dates of when that is. And then maybe in the 30s they open up again, so you have another wave of East Africans that go up to Britain for training. But there's this long gap when there's hardly anybody going to get medical training because there's just not any place to go. But they do, a few of them do make their way to Meharry and to some of the West Africans to Howard and are, get their start there.
Any last questions? Okay, with that, we can
Thank
say
you
thank
all.
you very much.